now we have the meditation. Patricia Guy will be doing that for us.
Good morning. We're going to do a very simple meditation today just to get us ready to receive the different worldview. Says it's on, there it goes, okay. Just to get us ready to receive a different worldview. So, very simply, it's going to be focus plus relaxation is all we're asking you to do. And we're just going to direct where you place your attention. So those who care to, you may close your eyes. It does help if you sit up straight, uncross your legs. You can look just with a soft gaze in front of you if you don't want to close your eyes. And we're going to start by just taking a very deep breath. Just allow yourself to let the air fall deeply into your lungs. 1. And exhale. 2. And exhale. 3. And exhale. Now I'd like you to place your attention over your entire body and notice any places where there's held tension. For me, it's in my neck and shoulders. See where it is for you, any place that's tense. And first, just notice it and breathe. And now suggest to that part of the body that you're going to allow it to relax. If it's been protecting, guarding, tell it right now you're off duty. Let it relax. Now move and see if another part of your body is also tense. For some, it might be the forehead where tension is held. For some, the top of the head. Thighs might be tense from walking on cobblestones. Lower back. Wherever it is, just say, thank you for trying to protect me, now you can relax. And now in a more open space, allow your attention to gently expand to the space around you. Notice where there might be heat, where there might be coolness, a bit of a breeze. Allow your attention to expand to the level of the trees, the song of the birds. Allow the attention to expand to the level of the mountains behind us, the lake in front of us, and up to the level of the clouds. Now we'll gently bring our attention back home from the bowl of the mountain and the lake to this garden to about 5 feet around you, and bring the attention back home to your own heart. And if you have the courage, give your own heart a little loving attention. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter and a friend of mine, Rachel McMillen. Her talk is entitled Back to the Future. Noam Chomsky recently stated that it's a kind of irony that all over the world, the leading forces in trying to prevent a race to disaster are the indigenous communities. Could it be that the very people we have marginalized are the ones who can save us from ourselves? What can we learn from our original people, and will they agree to teach us? Rachel McMillen is the author of the Dan Connor Mystery Series, which combines A hint of politics, a dab of environmental issues, a good dollop of native culture, and a full helping of fast-paced action. That's from Writers Weekly. At various times, she has been a teacher, a facilitator, an accountant, a business owner, and through all of it, a wife and mother. She and her husband sailed the West Coast on their 36-foot sailboat for over 30 years. Please help me welcome Rachel.
Try again.
That's not working.
No.
Yes?
Yes, that's working? Okay.
Take my stuff away and...
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Lovely to see you all here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Welcome to each one of you and to all my relations. Those of you that were here when I had the privilege of being here last year might remember that I spoke about that greeting then. And in a way, I'm going to speak about it again today, although not nearly so directly. For those of you that haven't heard it before, it is a First Nations or Indian, if you wish, greeting. And I should explain the term First Nations for those of you who are not Canadian. First Nations is a term which the Native people of Canada came up with. It is a political term. And because there are so many very, very tiny tribes or groups or bands there now, they decided that in order to give them more clout, more power, they would come up with a name that served that purpose. And so they are referred to as First Nations throughout Canada. So if you hear me saying First Nations, it's Native Americans, Native Canadians, Native folks, Indigenous folks. You know, as I made my way here this morning, I couldn't help but think how lucky I am to live in this place. The lake, the mountains, the birds. Lou just referred to the birds. I stopped and had a look at how the parrots are doing down there. The flowers, the people, everything. It really is a paradise. And yet, even here, there are signs that not everything is good, that not everything is going well. And I'm not talking about politics north of the border. From my house, I am blessed. I have an absolutely fabulous view across farm fields down to the lake. And it looks over a number of ejido fields and ranch fields, which a month or so ago was planted with corn. One field was left untended. It had been tilled many, many months before, but the only thing growing in it, at least until a few weeks ago, were weeds and grasses. And there were butterflies, and there were bees, and there were birds that were building their nest in the weeds. And they grew with the rain, and they were a vibrant, healthy green, until a group of men arrived in a truck with a container on the back. One of them walked up and down the rows for several hours, spraying from a tank he carried on his back. Within days, the weeds turned brown. They died. The butterflies left, the birds left, the insects left. It became a wasteland. Then about a week after that, more men arrived with bags of small white onions. And they spent 4 days bent over in the hot sun, planting hundreds and hundreds of onions along the top of the furrows. 2 days after they finished, another group of men showed up with another truck and another container. Once again, one of them walked up and down the planted rows and sprayed them all a second time. Now, I don't know what they used on either occasion, although I suspect it was Monsanto's Roundup the first time, but I do know I don't want to eat those onions. To me, what I was watching was really a sign of the times. Our grandmothers, even our mothers, cleaned their house with homemade soap. They washed their windows with vinegar. They did the washing with vinegar very often too. They make jams and jellies from berries they picked themselves. We do none of that, or at least not very much. We buy our cleaning products and our food ready-made,
packaged in spray bottles and containers made of plastic or styrofoam that end up in landfills or polluting the oceans. Even the berries we buy here in Ajijic come from fields that are covered and protected from the sun and the rain. And that's a practice that many agricultural experts say destroys the soil even as it creates the blemish-free fruit that we demand. And we believe it's all okay because the ads on TV tell us so. We really are the generation that has been formed by the media. How many of us remember the Rolling Stones song? I remember dancing to this back when I was 16 or so. A man comes on to tell me how white my shirt should be. He can't be a man because he doesn't smoke the same cigarettes as me. Even our music gives us the message that we all have to buy the right stuff, the new and improved stuff. We're bombarded by ads that tell us these products are better, that they're new, that they're improved. They mean less work. And who doesn't want less work? So we buy them. But do we really know the cost? Do we care? I think that very soon we are going to have to care. Our earth, the only home we have, which the native people right across, certainly North America, refer to as Turtle Island, is going to demand that we change our ways. That we stop killing her plants with herbicides and chopping down all her trees. That we stop pouring oil and solvents into her lakes and rivers. That we stop forcing water and chemicals deep into her skin. That we stop filling her atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Already, the temperatures are soaring. Australia, and you can all hear my accent, I think. I can't hear it anymore, but I know it's there. Australia suffered a 9-day heat wave where temperatures reached over 104 degrees Fahrenheit every day. And in fact, one day it reached over 114 degrees. That was in southern Australia. It's furthest away from the equator, and it's normally a very temperate climate. The result was the Black Saturday fire that saw 374 people dead. The huge fire in northern Alberta, in Canada, earlier this year destroyed the city of Fort McMurray. It displaced 125,000 people. It raged out of control for over 2 months, and it covered an area larger than the state of Delaware. It has cost almost $7 billion so far. It reduced the second quarter GDP of all of Canada by 0.6%, and the cleanup has barely started. Already we have severe droughts in areas that once had reliable and predictable rainfall. In Africa, over 36 million people have been displaced because of the drought. Most of California is experiencing an extreme drought, and parts of Alaska and even Hawaii are abnormally dry. In fact, a large part of the Big Island of Hawaii is categorized as suffering severe drought. At the same time, we have massive floods. In the US alone, and I don't think this list covers all of them, floods have occurred in West Virginia, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, and even in Las Vegas, in the middle of the desert. And this is just the beginning. We're at the very start of massive climate change. And as it continues, food and water, the two basic necessities of life, will become scarcer. And we're already seeing that happen. So what can we do? How will our children, and perhaps more importantly, more specifically, our grandchildren, deal with all this? Who will teach them what they need to learn? Where will they find the knowledge that allows them to grow crops in areas that have become a desert? It certainly won't be the big corporations. They have already proved they aren't interested in our well-being. Their only interest is profits, and profits at any cost. As an example, in Saskatchewan, Canada, there are an estimated 2 oil spills per day. The latest one, which spilled 250,000 litres of oil and solvent into a major river, has polluted drinking water sources for hundreds of miles and put a number of communities into crisis mode. Now, all this may sound like a tale of doom and gloom, but I don't believe it is. I believe there are people who are living around us who can show us exactly what we need to know and how to do it. The problem is not a scarcity of knowledge or of experience. It's a problem of perception. We simply don't hear the very people we need to hear. We don't even see them. They are largely invisible, banished to small, often arid wastelands that we, the newcomers to these lands, charmingly call reserves. Yet, as Noam Chomsky recently said, Indigenous people across the world are the only ones who are keeping the human race from destroying itself. He's right. Here's a few examples. All of these headlines appeared within 3 days last week. Number 1, First Nation sets precedent with an injunction to delay the Trans-Canada Mountain Pipeline. That's an oil pipeline that is very unpopular with a lot of people, but which the government is pushing. 2, the Lower Nicola Indian Band, that's a band in the southern interior of British Columbia, installs the largest community-owned solar panel in British Columbia. Number 3, Fort Nelson First Nation wins precedent-setting decision that cancels the water license of a natural gas fracking operation. Number 4, BC First Nation Site C Dam Challenge plays out in federal court. Site C is a provincial government project that supposedly will provide hydroelectric power to the government-owned electric utility, which has already said they don't need it. So we're not quite sure who's getting the money out of that one. Number 5, members of Native American tribe turned down $267,000 per person to allow a pipeline through their land. Number 6, the current Dakota pipeline protest, which most of you will have seen or heard about in the news. There's something interesting about that pipeline protest that you may not know. In 2014, the planned route of that pipeline went through Bismarck, the capital city of North Dakota. It's a city of about 61,000. And of course the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in to check it out, and they refused it. They said the danger to the drinking water system in Bismarck was too high. So they moved it to the Indian Reserve, which is why the Dakota people and the Sioux that live there are protesting it. It means the pipeline would have to run under the Mississippi River and the Missouri. So again, when you see all these wonderful news clips, well, you don't see nearly enough of them actually on TV, but there's almost no white faces there. It's all the Indigenous people. The Indigenous people of Turtle Island, the name they give to the American continent, are putting their money, their mouths, their bodies, and in some cases their freedom, on the line to protect the earth. But those Indigenous people themselves are at risk. Canada, the USA, and Australia have all made progress in human rights over the last few years. Canada now has a parliament composed of 50% women, one of whom is an Afghani refugee, and 10 of the 338 members of parliament and 105 senators have some link to First Nations. The USA has a black president and a female presidential contender, although only 2 of the members of the House, none in the Senate, claim Aboriginal ancestry. In Australia, there are none. In fact, in Australia, up till 1967, Aboriginal people were officially classified as flora and fauna. So we are obviously not encouraging our Aboriginal people to participate in our governments or our institutions in any meaningful way, and therefore their voice is not heard in any official capacity, and it doesn't play a role in any official policy. On the other hand, Aboriginal people make up 4% of the total Canadian population, but they make up 25% of the prison population. In Australia, the 2.5% of the population who are Aboriginal make up 26% of the prison population. Are we seeing a trend? I guess when we failed to solve the Indian problem, as the man charged with setting up residential schools in Canada proselytized in 1920, and as US Brigadier General R.D. Pratt promoted in the Chicago Times in 1910, then putting those that survived in jail becomes the next best option. And you might have noticed that I haven't mentioned the US numbers yet. When I was doing the research for this presentation, I first thought that the USA was doing much, much better than either Canada or Australia. Just under 2% of the US population are listed as Native Americans, and incarceration records showed only 3% of the prison population were Native, which is pretty good. Turned out that most Native Americans are included in the category called non-Hispanic blacks, and they actually make up 32% of the prison population. And they officially acknowledged that incarceration of Native Americans has increased to 27% over the past 5 years. All that on top of the horror of the residential or industrial school programs that destroyed an entire generation of Indigenous children and their families, leaving those that survived without their language, without their culture, and without parenting skills. And those wounds are still open sores. The last residential school in Australia closed in the 1980s. Has anybody seen Rabbit Proof Fence, the movie? Very, very powerful movie and very accurate. The last one in Canada closed in 1996. This is our time. And as late as 2007, there were still Indian industrial schools operating in the United States. My daughter-in-law, whose mother spent her childhood in a residential school, doesn't know which tribe she belongs to. Has no idea. Her mother was taken many, many miles away from her home when she was only 5 years old. She was beaten if she spoke her language, told she was a dirty Indian in between being sexually molested. And when she was 16, like all of the kids that went to residential school, they were simply released into whatever community they were in, and many of them were thousands of miles from home. So not surprisingly, she became an alcoholic, although she always struggled to care for her 5 kids. As recently as July of this year, there was a story on the CBC, that's the Canadian Broadcasting Commission. Excuse me. It was about an Inuk mother who finally found a daughter she had spent 50 years searching for, 2,000 kilometers from her home. The girl had been taken away when she was just 4 years old. Her tombstone indicated she had died when she was 8. The Indigenous people of North America, those that are left, have lived here for over 40,000 years. The Australian Aborigines represent the oldest surviving culture in the world, going back over 60,000 years. In fact, a story I read yesterday said scientists have now moved that date back, and they're saying 71,000 years. We white folk, on the other hand, have only been here on the North American continent, or in Australia, 500 or so years, and we've already managed to damage it almost beyond repair. Before white contact, the Indigenous people lived in complete harmony with the land, and that's part of "and all my relations," the greeting that they offer. They fished, hunted, harvested, and gleaned in such a way that no damage was done, and no resource was depleted. You might say that was because there were so few of them. That's not really the case. Numbers before white contact were almost 100 times what they are today. Perhaps more. In the US, there are currently some 900,000 native people left of an estimated 10 million that inhabited the area before Columbus arrived. Haida Gwaii, which is 100 miles off the northwest coast of Canada and 70 miles south of Alaska, is perhaps one of the best places to study both the ancient and the recent history of Native Americans, simply because it's so remote. It has also managed to escape glaciation during at least 1 and possibly 2 ice ages, largely due to the warm current that passes its shores. So if you're going up near Alaska, you can actually swim in Haida Gwaii. That means, among other things, that the shallow waters that surround it were high and dry during those times, and the old village sites that were built there and which are now submerged are easier to find and to study. So we know for sure there were originally between 50 and 60,000 Haida living there, and after White Contact, the number dropped to 600. Now, of course, that's only one tribe in one location. And while there were many other tribes in many other locations, they certainly didn't build huge cities like New York or LA or Mexico City or Sydney or even Toronto, with their overcrowding and the density issues that happened there. But the fact is that wherever they did have their towns, they managed to live without damaging the earth. We don't. It's that simple. So can we learn anything from them that will help us survive these climate changes? Of course we can. And it's a surprisingly enjoyable lesson. This past June, I was fortunate enough to be invited to Haida Gwaii to launch my most recent book, which is set up there. I spent 4 amazing days, and I was a guest at 2 feasts. I can't possibly call them just dinners. They were feasts. While each one was different, they were both delicious. They both served nothing but locally harvested food. Our appetizer for the first one was 1 complete Dungeness crab each. There was salmon prepared 5 different ways. There was halibut soup. There was venison. There was herring roe on kelp, which to my surprise I found I absolutely loved. There was sea asparagus. There was lamb's quarters, those little woolly weeds we call them, blue-green leaves. Seasoning was done with spruce tips, the tips of the spruce tree, the unopened tips, or oolican oil. It was all natural. It was all harvested directly from the land or the ocean. Unlike further south, wild salmon numbers are not declining up there. Perhaps that's because there's no open net fish farms, and don't get me going on fish farms, because I could be here till next week. Herring roe availability goes up and down, but thanks to the Haida standing firm against the Department of Fisheries, who want to allow harvesting no matter what the level is, the trend is upwards. Crabs can be harvested in huge numbers right off the beach, as can sea urchin and sea cucumber and mussels and oysters and clams and abalone and. It's amazing. Now obviously you and I can't eat like this, which is a shame because the Haida, who had almost no history of diabetes or heart disease or cancer prior to the residential school fiasco, are finding the incidence of all those illnesses dropping rapidly as they return to their traditional ways. But there are things that we can do, and which I think, in fairness to our grandchildren, I am certainly not advocating that we should all rush off and live in longhouses or teepees, nor that we should live off the land. To ask that would be both unrealistic and a complete understatement and impossibility. But we can work to reduce our dependence on prepackaged food and chemical-based cleaners, and we can better our understanding of and respect for Indigenous cultures. We can teach ourselves to look at Indigenous communities with new eyes and an open mind that refuses to judge those communities by our colonial standards. We can acknowledge their knowledge and wisdom and learn from them. Let me give you some simple examples of how easy it is to judge by our preconceived conditions, of how we dismiss whole groups of people, and in doing so we ensure that we also dismiss their knowledge and their culture. On a same recent trip up to Haida Gwaii, a group of us were invited to the house of Jim Hart. Jim is a hereditary chief of one of the Haida clans. He's a world-famous carver and jewelry maker. He's currently carving a huge totem pole, certainly the biggest pole I have ever seen. It's called the Reconciliation pole, that has been commissioned by the University of British Columbia. It's going to be erected at the entrance to the Science Building next month, and I will be there for that occasion. As we drove up to his house, which stands on the shores of Masset Inlet, one of the group said something like, "Pretty sad house." And to white eyes it appeared to be. It's unpainted. It's clad in very weathered wood siding. Nothing has been done to it to improve it or maintain it. It's surrounded by long grass and weeds. And it had what White Eyes judged as a pretty unkempt and unloved look, as did all the other houses on the reserve. But Jim, ever the gentleman, invited us inside. And there it's very different. This is where the family lives. It's where it gathers. This is where the love and care is apparent. It's clean, immaculately clean, has modern appliances, comfortable furniture, and of course, amazing artwork. And Jim actually spends his winters in Zihuatanejo. And he collects Mexican art. And so the downstairs of this house is absolutely filled with the most amazing Mexican art. It rivals the beauty of the traditional art upstairs. Houses for the indigenous people up there, like the totem poles, are left natural and chemical free. So they can return to the earth without polluting it. So no, they do not paint their houses, and no, they don't stain their houses, and no, they don't do weird and wonderful things to the outside of them to make them look better. Neither Jim nor the other folk that live in the village make any attempt at gardening, because they cannot conceive anything more valuable or beautiful than what naturally grows there. As one native friend of mine said, as he indicated the wilderness outside, there's a restaurant out there. We only have to step outside. Why would he plant something that was not native to the area? It makes absolutely no sense. I also remember one sailing trip up the coast, the west coast of Vancouver Island, that my husband and I made. We pulled into a tiny native community called Cayucot. It's only accessible by boat. It consists of perhaps 10 or 12 houses that are built in a circle on top of a medium bank waterfront above the beach. Somebody on another boat at the wharf said something like, "Stupid Indians don't even know a good view when they see it." And their friends laughed. All of them completely missed the fact that the house arrangement was a testament to the emphasis on family. And you'll find it over and over again in First Nations villages. It's a testament to the emphasis on family found in all native communities, just as the lack of fences in all native communities reflects the fact that native people do not believe they own the earth, or even a small piece of it. They are simply a part of it, one with it. We belong to the earth, not the other way around. No fences are needed. That belief that we do not own the earth but are part of it is what we need to espouse. We have to learn to respect the earth in the same way that they do. We have to learn to fight to preserve it. Why? Here's one very, very small example. The great fjords of the British Columbia coast, and they're incredibly long and they're incredibly deep. They were formed by glaciation many thousands of years ago. In fact, just to give you some idea of how many and how long, if you fly as the crow flies between Vancouver in the south and Prince Rupert in the north, it's roughly 800 miles. If you were to go up and down every inlet on the way down, it's just over 20,000 miles. So that area has a massive rainfall, and the region is part of the Pacific Temperate Rainforest ecoregion as defined by the World Wildlife Fund. That ecosystem is so productive that the biomass in the best sites, and this is critically important to all of us no matter where we live, is at least 4 times greater than that of any comparable area in the tropics. The first survey to systematically explore the forest canopy in the Carmana Valley of Vancouver Island yielded 15,000 new species, a third of all invertebrates known to exist in Canada, and among the collection were 500 species previously unknown to science. So what? Why do you care? Well, almost all modern drugs are based on substances found in the natural world. Aspirin, based on the willow tree. Quinine to treat malaria was based on the bark of the quinine tree. Penicillin's based on mold. Now we're learning that marijuana oil can treat cancer and Parkinson's. All the drug companies do is change a couple of molecules in order to be able to patent it. What that means is that firstly, the traditional knowledge of the indigenous people that live there is invaluable. And second, loss of any species is critical to all of us. The effects of climate change even now are far greater than we think. Back in 2006, climate change brought drought to that ecoregion. Towns like Tofino, who some of you may have visited, the surfing town on Vancouver Island, usually has over 3,300 millimeters or 130 inches of rain a year. That year, it ran out of water. Headlines such as "Visitors Scramble as Water Shortage Shuts Tofino Businesses" documented the struggle. At the same time, further north up the coast in the tiny community of Bella Coola, which has an annual rainfall of just over 100 inches, the creeks running off the surrounding mountains almost disappeared, and the level of the Bella Coola River dropped significantly. Salmon could not make their way to their spawning grounds, so the entire run was lost. Bears and wolves and eagles starved. Beavers moved closer to the river, and the dams they built there subsequently flooded homes and farms when the rains returned and the rivers backed up. All that because of a drought that lasted a couple of months. But the effects are still being felt. While changing our ways and our perceptions may not halt climate change, it can certainly slow it. And being willing to learn better ways of living in harmony with the earth will assist in that process, even as it allows us to adapt to the changes that are to come. Gilakasla, Miigwech, Hawa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Very, very excellent.
Yes.
Excuse me, can you wait until the mic comes to you, and if you'll stand up and ask the question? Here in the green shirt.
This lady. This one.
Is that my color? Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I do agree that there are many problems, but I have the suspicion that you're presenting an image of the noble savage.
No, they've got as many problems and as many issues as we do, but they do have a lot of knowledge that we do not have.
Okay, I will agree with that. But for example, considering some of the problems that they have had even before the Europeans came, think of the Maya, for example. The problems, their cities disappeared because apparently they were overexploiting the soil around them with their corn and so on. So anyway, I just want to bring this up.
And climate change, by the way, is not, I don't even know that it's the right term. We've always had climate change.
Okay. Anyway, I'm supposed to ask a question. Let me ask you, have you read the book 1492?
No, I haven't.
It is very good because it...
By who?
1491.
Is it 1491? Sorry.
Before Columbus.
Yeah, okay.
Do you know who wrote it?
I don't remember. It talks about all the civilizations that were here before he came in the navigation era.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm European, I'm not familiar with residential schools. I don't know what they are.
Residential schools were something that the settlers, the newcomers to North America and to Canada, so the colonial folks, the people that came from England and settled those countries, decided was needed in order to make the savages that were here into little white people. And so they basically, it's too political to say they kidnapped them, but they did in those cases. That there are some instances where they actually put the kids into cattle trains.
But they took just the children.
Yes, from as young as 4.
You spoke about Monsanto, and I saw a lot of heads bobbing here in agreement with you. What exactly does GMO mean to you, and how, scientifically, how does that affect you?
Genetically modified organisms, genetically modified produce, basically plants, that will resist being killed by Roundup, which is Monsanto's herbicide. And the idea being that at that point the crops will grow faster, it'll be a better return for the farmer, However, in the course of spraying with the herbicide, not so much the genetically modified plant, but the herbicide itself kills birds, butterflies, bees, whatever else, does immense damage to the soil. And I personally am not convinced that the modified products that they come up with are necessarily good for us. But that's a personal view.
In the back.
Teresa in the back.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I came across something very short. Indigenous person in Mexico said that, and I translated, I will try. When the last tree going to be gone, when the last fish going to be fished, and the last river going to dry up, we cannot eat money.
In the middle?
Thank you. Just for your information, Monsanto was just bought by Bayer Leverkusen in Germany. So, any Germans here, protest.
How are the natives managing health-wise? I mean, they have a tremendous problem with alcohol, and is that general across the continent, or are there pockets? I give one example. The head civil servant in charge of provincial prisons in Ontario, that is prisoners with less than 2 year sentence. And he said that, you know, basically the population, prison population is native, and he said that 2/3 of them suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome.
There is a huge problem with that, and that's largely the gift of the residential school system. It depends on which band, to a large extent. There's been one band that has been in the news recently in Canada that had 16 suicides in 1 week. That's up in the far north. On the other hand, you go to some of the bands that are doing much better, and we are getting more bands that are starting to really economically and culturally turn things around. You find very little of it. And in fact, probably one of the wealthiest bands, should I say, that's doing very well economically and culturally is in Soyuz in southern British Columbia. Chief Louis has been there for many years, and he's brilliant as far as being an economic leader. In fact, he's created his own school, which white parents now want to attend. There is 100% employment on band land. They've started the first winery in British Columbia. They have their own construction company. And when he first came into office, he said, here's the deal. Anybody on this reserve that has a problem with drugs and alcohol, come see me. We will do whatever it takes to help you. If you do not come and see me, leave. And he's stuck with that. He's been there now for about 16 years. Haida have very little in the way of alcoholism now because they've turned it around. They are remote and they have managed to turn around the community. So it varies vast differences depending on which band and where they are.
I also want to echo the words of thanks for an outstanding presentation. For 2 years, I took care of Native Alaskans, the Yupik Eskimos, through the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation a few years ago. And the wisdom of the Native people is something that, in my opinion, is grossly underestimated. And I'd like to take just a moment to relate a true story. The very first week that I was working with the health center in Bethel, Alaska, there was an old Yupik elder. He was 97 years old. He was leaving the hospital to go back to his village. He was recovering from a short bout of pneumonia. which unfortunately is a very common disease up there because of the harshness of the weather and numerous other factors. And a nursing student asked him how he had managed to live so long. He's 97 years old and was still very hale and healthy and getting over his pneumonia, which he'd only been in the hospital 4 days. And she asked him, how have you stayed so healthy? And with the wisdom of the elders, he replied to her something that I would like to have crocheted on my wall. It said, he said, don't drink, no smoke, one wife, good boat.
Any other questions up here?
She's got a really bad back there.
Yeah, let her sit.
No.
Just recovering from some
I know.
major surgery. Oh, you know.
I know.
Everybody knows, I guess.
Blame him.
I wanted to know if you are involved in any programs or projects here in Mexico with Indigenous people in Mexico?
Not really, no. I haven't found any, and I'm so seldom here, I guess, in terms of the long term, that I keep disappearing back up to Canada and BC for book readings and things. But it's certainly something I would be very interested in getting involved in. But not yet.
I would like to say on Rachel's behalf that if you like adventure stories that talk about the Northwest, I think some of Rachel's writing is some of the best I've seen. So we're not supposed to do advertisements there, she's not, but I can't delay Randy's, please.